In this special tribute episode, we're honoring the genius of Brian Wilson, the visionary behind the Beach Boys and one of the most influential composers in pop music history. From sun-soaked harmonies and teenage symphonies to complex emotional landscapes, Wilson's music has transcended generations. God only knows what we'd be without him. Stay with us.
Get ready for the 3324 podcast, where lifelong friends Dean Legiro and Eric Kuber share their love of all things music and movies. Dean has directed short films and is a music trivia buff. And Eric, trained in audio engineering, brings his extensive knowledge of music and film to the conversation as they discuss, debate, and celebrate their favorite albums, films, and much more.
Welcome, friends, to a very special, possibly melancholy, but very celebratory episode of the 3324 podcast. One of the titans of the music industry and one of the titans of our Eric and mine and Mr. Christopher Clark's collective musical landscape has passed away, Mr. Brian Wilson. And we're going to spend this time on this episode celebrating the life and the strife that this person went through. We talk about it a lot, and Eric, that we are unfortunately in the age where we're going to be seeing our musical heroes pass through, which is a really great, in one way, it's a great thing that we were alive. Technically, we were alive when the Beatles were together. We were very young, but we were born. We were alive when Led Zeppelin was in their heyday. I mean, we were here for all that. But then the flip side of that coin, right?
It was nice to be around, but also be young enough to not know it at first, and then get to know it. Yep. As we grew into our own musical world or whatever, everything was sort of an open door for us. The 80s did that for us. So we were just getting into these groups, and but yeah, these episodes they're just getting harder and harder. these tributes, there's just so many so many of the greats are just it's so soon.
We're not here to talk about them, but just it has to be noted that the day before we lost Brian, Sly Stone from Sly and the Family Stone passed away as well, who was also a musical genius in his own right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I just watched Long Promised Road, which was the doc on Prime about Brian. And funnily enough, ironically enough, we talked about Genesis and Duke, and I know that I'm going to just go right there because with the mention of Sly Stone, there's that connection of misunderstanding, and how I pointed out Phil was talking about how it sounds like Sail on Sailor. Well, in the documentary, the reporter is in the car with Brian, and he was talking about Sly Stone, ironically, and he's like, "Yeah, Sly would, he'd come over to my house, and he slept over one night, and the first song he mentioned was Hot Fun in the Summertime." Yeah. So there it is. So there's, it's validated.
And Sly Stone was also a tortured artist. I mean, he actually. Somewhat of a similar beginning trajectory in the 70s. Sly Stone, had his share of drug problems, and it really took a toll on him, and he receded, and unfortunately
never really came back.
Yeah, he tried, but he really wasn't able to really kind of make it happen. And and Brian was the same thing. I mean, we'll get there, but in the 70s, he was basically, kind of written off even by the Beach Boys to the point where within the Beach Boys, he was still writing and contributing and begrudgingly singing, but he doesn't appear on any album covers during that run of stuff in the 70s. He's not listed. He's not, if you look at, Friends and 2020 and all these different album covers of stuff that was coming out, he's not even on there. He's not even considered a member.
It's crazy
because he was that much, that damaged. But let's roll back a little bit. And talk about this person. The word genius is almost exclusively thrown around when it comes to Brian Wilson. Like you hear it with maybe McCartney, but not as much. I think you only hear it with Brian. Like I've never heard of Bob Dylan referred to as being a genius. Maybe his lyrics being ingenious or genius, but I don't know. I think Brian is the only one that's ever really consistently gets that moniker.
Well, I think
ascribed to him.
I think the term genius it is used. I think a lot, but I think what I think you're really getting at is the fact that he's compared to people like Mozart and like classical. I mean,
yes.
And this is not light talk. I mean, this is actual. People actually believe this in his complex harmonies and melodies and the way he constructed this stuff was just like unlike anything anybody has ever done since those gentlemen way back in the day. So yeah, I mean, I think you don't really hear anybody else being compared to such long hair type, like that kind of stuff.
Such eternal luminaries,
absolutely,
right? Like Beethoven and Bach, and you think of those people as so far away, and we can't connect to that. And what was that all about? And people are firmly saying, well, this man, is the modern day version of that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and the American version of it.
I was going to say I would agree, and really, I'm sure there are classical artists in the American lexicon, but we don't think about them the way we think of Brian Wilson or talk about him in the hushed tones. He really is the closest thing I think we as Americans do have to a Bach or a Beethoven or anything that we could at least wrap our head around and understand it in the 20th and 21st century, 20th and now the 21st century.
Yeah. Yeah. So Brian Douglas Wilson was born June 20th, 1942 in Inglewood, California. He passed away on June 11th, 2025, just shy. 9 days shy of 83. He had been sick for a while. He stopped touring, I think, in 2022, which was enough for him. I mean, the guy, again, the comeback that the guy was able to mount was nothing short of monumental, especially with everything that was going on. But born in California in 1942, two younger brothers, Dennis Wilson and Carl Wilson, and he had a cousin, Mike Love, and a friend, Alan Jardine, and also another friend, David Marks. And they decided in the late 50s, early 60s, like I believe the story goes, Murray Wilson and Brian's mother and father were going away on vacation, and they left money for food. They left them, the boys, money to, go grocery shopping, do what you have to do. And what they did instead is they rented instruments. They took that money, went down to the music store, rented, got a bass, got a drum, got an amp and a guitar, got, their cousin Mike Love over, and I think the first thing that they recorded was the song Surfin'.
Yep.
So they just kind of, it was always there. Brian was always, even though he was 90% deaf in his right ear, supposedly from abuse from his father, had the voice of an angel. His head voice was mainly falsetto, and he can just soar. Mm-hmm. His influences were the Four Freshmen, were vocal groups of the time, of the kind of the what we would probably call barbershop quartet-esque vocal groups, but not the Elvis stuff. Carl, little brother Carl, was into the rock and roll stuff. But Brian was into Gershwin and listening to arrangements and picking apart vocal, vocal lines and multi-part harmonies. That was what he was kind of spending his time doing. So by the time they put this group together, you've got this amalgamation of kind of rock and roll, which was kind of seeing a resurgence in the 60s after Elvis had gone into the army. Things had kind of gotten a little soft. You had like the teeny boppers, and then in the 60s, you just kind of started to see things turn back around again. So they got a band together, called themselves the Beach Boys, and talked about what you talk about in California, right, Chris? You talk about surf, you talk about girls, and you talk about cars. Those are the three main things on your mind when you're a teenager in California in the 60s.
And the funny part is, and I'm sure everybody knows this, there was only one Beach Boy that actually surfed.
Yeah.
Dennis is the only one.
That's true. Yeah.
But it's interesting how profound an influence Dennis was on Brian's early work, that Dennis could tell him about, like drag races and riding around on motorbikes and surfing. And Brian could take that and turn it into this really brilliant and amazing music, and use those lyrics at least as, the first step towards what he would go on to do later. I mean, and some of that early surfing music is brilliant. I mean, it's all of his stuff. I don't think I've ever heard anything truly terrible that he ever did. So
yeah. And I think part one of the Beach Boys Brian Wilson saga is that creating the myth of California.
Yes.
They literally create, about catching, it's surf. It's always sunny. There's always girls around. You jump in your car and you have rivals, car clubs, and creating this idyllic idea of California for the rest of the country. Most of the country except for the East Coast is landlocked. So that, this was them kind of almost like a travelogue of California, and saying how great it is, and creating this kind of myth, of California, Eric, right? It's kind of like they single-handedly kind of, by embracing the surf culture and the car culture, kind of like Chris said, we're able to turn it into songs that really made you kind of want to be like, wow, I got to get to California.
Yeah, right. That's true. And sadly, I've never been.
To
this day, I've yet to go there. But you're right. But yeah, it's almost like Brian took that and actually created a soundscape for California. Just just in these aren't just songs to me. They're just, this is what California is sounds like. And I honestly think that there's quite a few of his contemporaries would agree with that. People, especially people from California, would turn around and say, "Hey, yeah, and these guys were it." Even though there were other bands that were kind of doing their sound, trying to replicate that, but I don't think any of them really kind of matched what they were about.
Jan and Dean probably came the closest.
Probably, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Brian wrote Surf City for them.
There you go.
So.
I think they all went to the same high school too, if I'm not mistaken. A journalist wrote a book a few years ago about the school they all went to.
Yeah, it became this whole, again, this mythological thing of endless summers and beaches and women and guys and hanging out and all that great stuff. They were signed to Capitol Records in 1962, so Brian was only 20. Which means Dennis was maybe 18 or 19, and Carl was, I think, 16.
Wasn't David Marks like 14 or 15?
And David Marks, and David really Marks was the youngest member, and then he ended up leaving. Al Jardine joined. I believe he left. He was going to go become a dentist, and then David Marks came back in, and then Al Jardine said no, and then he, and then Al Jardine.
I think Marks had a fight with Murray, and then got kicked out, and that's what opened the door for Al to come back.
Yeah. So, I think there's two things I think we want to accomplish.
Yeah.
I think we need to accomplish two things in this episode. I think we need to separate, because, in looking at, when Brian passed on social media, a lot of tributes or just people, friends on Facebook that were commenting, and people were like, oh, I never got into the Beach Boys, so I don't know. And I think it's important to separate the Beach Boys from the man, because I think when you say Beach Boys, you immediately think of a certain type of music. And yes, that is a part of it, but that is not what people are referring to when they talk about the genius of Brian Wilson. They're not talking about, they are, but they're not specifically talking about, Surfing USA and Catch a Wave and all that kind of stuff. That is part of it, but when people throw the Beach Boys name around, I think they're almost doing a disservice, or not realizing what they're, how you need to pull Brian out of that at some point. And then also, I just need to, it always comes up, but I think the Beatles, the more I think about the Beatles dynamic and the Beach Boys, the more I've come to even more realizations about the difference between the two. So I think, I think the first place to start off at, and some of the differences between the Beach Boys and the Beatles, and why Brian is known as a genius, and why he's talked about in that way. is he was recognized as the leader of the band. Like in all the interviews, Mike Love, here's our leader, Brian Wilson. So that is right there a different dynamic than the Beatles. Yep. The Beatles really didn't have a leader per se, right? There was two main songwriters. Everybody wrote, but there was two main songwriters, but not really one chief.
Yeah, well,
right?
I mean, towards the end, I feel like it became Paul, but that I don't think really happened until after Brian Epstein died. Yeah,
it was four Musketeers, and
yeah, for sure,
right?
And Paul McCartney, later on. I mean, but it was
very democratic.
I don't think it was a case of him just basically, I'm boasting, I am the most, The proof was in the pudding. I mean, Paul really earned that. If you consider him the leader.
Mm-hmm. He kind of
earned that through what he did and what he accomplished and the guy could write a song like that. We've seen it.
He was very driven. He was a very driven artist.
Yes.
Right. Well, you keep creating.
And then again, it really kind of started to emerge after Brian Epstein died, where they really were kind of rudderless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think he felt like he needed to be that kind of guiding force that Brian Epstein was before he passed away.
But they still had that appearance. The
four
Beatles,
the four Musketeers. Yeah,
there was never anything different than that. There was never any proclamation of this or that.
There was a sort of humble attitude at first. When they would just just kids.
And I think
really,
it's easy to look back on that.
Sure,
and say, he was absolutely asserting more control and kind of doing that. But with the Beach Boys, it was kind of a given. It's like Brian.
They knew.
Leader.
Yeah, they all recognize the talent in Brian, and
he's the one that came up with the idea.
Right. He's the one that truly was a musician. I mean, Dennis kind of figured it out as he went along.
He drums.
Right. So really, Brian figured out how to make what he had work, and whereas the Beatles, they all were gifted in their own way. So
yeah. So ostensibly, what you have is Brian doing the work of all four Beatles plus George Martin.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yep. So, as the leader of the band, he kind of had that ability. And another contrast to the Beatles is Brian was not bound by the constraints of a band dynamic. The Beatles were very much kept themselves, except when they needed a horn player, they get a horn player. When they needed a violin, they do that. But Brian very early on did not let himself be constrained by feeling like he had to use the Beach Boys to achieve. If they couldn't achieve what he wanted, it was no hard feelings. It wasn't a mean thing, but he didn't feel bound by that.
Right. Yeah.
Which is another difference, right? So he did not kind of box himself in like the Beatles did, because they were a group and that's how they functioned.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other continent across the ocean, there was someone else who was in a group, but was not afraid to break those shackles of that and not feel like he owed it to the group to play if they could not get across what he needed to.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I wonder if, you see like certain dramatizations, for example, the movie where he's talking about the Beatles and we need to one up them. And I don't know if that's something that Brian would have actually said.
I don't think he would have either.
I don't think so.
I believe so.
Okay.
I think so. I think he was very driven and very much
driven, but in his own headspace.
Like that it was very much I think he was very competitive in that way, that he's
okay.
I always felt like it was coming from across the pond once the Beach Boys put out a record and the Beatles were like, holy shit. And I got to do this. And then, I never really got the sense it was, going in the other direction. Like,
I think that's where some of his own pressure came from. That also led to some of the problems. Yeah. Is that he was putting that it was him, right? He didn't have a group to also spread the load out, right? He took on that. I firmly believe that. And he said, in interviews, like, I was very competitive. I was, it was kind of like the thing, so I think he took that load on his shoulders. Whereas the other guys, again, nothing against them, but the other guys, Mike Love was a career singer, meaning that he was going to be perfectly happy to continue making money doing what was popular. Mm-hmm. That was going to be his career. Otherwise, if there was no career, what was Mike Love going to do? Meaning he'd have to go get a regular job just like anybody else.
Right.
So I think from his point of view, he wanted to keep things status quo because that's what the career dictated to him. It wasn't an artistic endeavor.
Which is why he was so leery of things like Pet Sounds and
whatever,
Smile and all those other things, because that's not the formula that's gotten us on the top of the charts for the last 4 or 5 years or whatever it was.
I think Brian had that artistic vision that the Beatles had. That was where the match was this can be more than that fun music. It got us to a certain point, but now we want to grow. Whereas again, and if you think about the music industry back then, just like Jan and Dean and the Sun Rays, and you had all these different, they were just kind of cranking that stuff out because that's what was popular. So you just kept, the move was you want to keep making money, you just keep making that music. But then all of a sudden, in the mid 60s, it became artistic and we want to say something with this and I can do more, but that type of music, right, Eric, was not really given that kind of respect. It's like rock and pop. That's all it is. It's kids music. It's not music that is like classical music. It doesn't aspire to
which
something
is
more.
Ridiculous.
Yeah,
they were wrong.
Yeah.
Absolutely,
very wrong. I mean, everybody deemed that kind of music as important and uplifting. And I dare say very conservative at the same time, because it's also, you're also equating that kind of music with religion and those kinds of things where there's a certain sect of that kind of, it's just very, it doesn't confuse people's minds and all this kind of thing. And, but then rock and roll came along, but Brian was, I believe he I think he might have, he was the guy. You look at him and you say, because he wasn't really, because he was putting all of that into pop music, which was, and combining the two, which is something that I can't, on one hand, I can't even count the amount of artists who could do that back in the day, like at that particular time.
Or have that,
or
have
even
that,
now, for that matter. So,
and even to have that grasp of music theory, like even the Beatles. I mean, as brilliant as Paul McCartney is, you can't say that he has the same.
Who didn't know how to write music, right?
And,
none of them
Wilson
did.
Has this understanding and grasp of music theory that he was able to apply to pop music in a way that none of his contemporaries ever could.
Yeah. And he had a really great teacher. I mean, from the jump, besides the 4 freshmen, he was enamored with the wall of sound production style of Phil Spector. And Phil Spector was not a musician. He was a producer and in the early 60s, very popular, a lot of girl groups and literally created a wall of instruments, the wall of sound that would be behind all these groups. And it would just be this thick layer of instruments just stacked on top of each other. And Brian became enamored with that. But again, it's always when you put it through a filter of something else. This is going through a filter of a 22-year-old guy who's
half deaf
is becoming a man, going through things. And here comes another fork in the road that I came to with the Beatles versus Brian Wilson's music. And I wrote in my notes, the Beatles made great music, but Brian makes emotional music. Like, I don't really get emotional listening to the Beatles, maybe a couple of songs.
Yeah.
But Brian had the innate ability through his vocals and through his arrangements to evoke emotions. They both wrote about the same content in the early 60s. I Want to Hold Your Hand. And, but then you hear something about like Don't Worry Baby, which is a totally different emotional pull.
In My Room.
In My Room. Warmth of the Sun. He is, they are singing about very similar subject matters, but he is putting in emotion and pulling it out, where the Beatles were very deft and very great at songwriting. And again, it's not to slam the Beatles, but it was something that, they were, but I didn't feel like the Beatles were writing about stuff that was specific to them. But when Brian, even though he probably didn't race his car in Don't Worry Baby, sounds like he did, or it sounds like he's putting something else, an emotion from something else into that.
There's an emotional truth to it.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, and then even like just the harmonies and the way he would design and lay out harmonies, those are the things that'll even like make you feel something without even lyrically. Like I think about the thing that always grabbed me, and I'm not Smile. Like there's things on Smile that stand out to me, and then there's things on Smile that this is clearly somebody that, to me, the way when I listen to Smile, I think about it, somebody struggling with what to do next and just being very overwhelmed. But then there are things on it that are brilliant. Like Our Prayer will make the hair on my arm stand up no matter how I hear it. And it's one of those things that like kind of just always gets to my soul. And it's there's no lyrics. It's just four guys like doing harmony notes. And it's just like so beautiful and genius. And like, there's not a lot of pop music that can make you feel that way without having to use lyrics or any of those other kinds of, it's just amazing just with voices to be that powerful. It's crazy to me.
Yeah. I mean, he touches your, it sounds corny, but I mean, he does, he touches your soul.
Mm-hmm.
And, to say soul in a pop context is, cause that's a form of music in itself. Right. I mean, but you're looking at, something different there, but uplifting and but he hits you with things that are relatable.
Mm-hmm.
Things that are like the Beatles. There's you give me like 100 songs by the Beatles, and I can't really think of any one song that I feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
And you're absolutely right about that. You're right. It's like, I don't feel the same way. Like this, they wrote a ton of love songs, but they don't affect me the way something like God Only Knows
that way.
God Only Knows does, or even Wouldn't It Be Nice? Just the way that song was constructed.
Let It Be might be the only one that I can think of off the top of my head that would make me feel that way. And
yeah, I mean,
that's one song.
There are some.
Musically, yes, I agree with you, Chris. I mean, musically, yes, there's there is that emotion there, but I'm talking about like just even some of the words, which Brian, had collaborated with with lyricists and things like that. So he was more on the music side of it, but combining those, there's nothing more powerful than the human voice, in my opinion. I think it's the ultimate instrument. So the Beatles could do that, but that came in time. I don't think their best harmonies came, I think, later, in my opinion. Yes. I think they just yes, they could harmonize in the early days, but they had that sort of certain whine to their to their vocals and things. And you know what I'm talking about. You get to Abbey Road, and the harmonies on that record are just outstanding. But it's like, but it took a while for it to get there.
Yeah,
whereas Brian had it right.
He had it from the start.
Yeah. I mean, he had a steady diet of 4-part harmonies and listening to that and absorbing it into himself. So it's,
let's not forget. I mean, the rest of the Beach Boys, they were all good singers.
Yeah. Oh, of course.
That's important. I mean, Mike Love had he had a good voice.
Yeah, he had Carl. He had a group of singers that had different vocal ranges. Mike was in the lower range, the bass.
Yeah.
So he had an embarrassment of riches and Carl was up on top with Brian. So he was able to construct harmonies that were very evenly, like you said, when Warmth of the Sun comes on, or any of those Beach Boy backing vocals, they're so thick.
Yeah.
And so layered and so even, like you're hearing the full spectrum. You're hearing you're hearing low bass tones and you're hearing high falsetto tones, all in the same vocal phrase.
I don't think I've ever heard a 3-part falsetto, because they could all do Carl and Dennis too. He could go there. It's like he could hit high until he started really
he destroyed himself.
Destroyed himself, and he became whatever. But when he's saying
the running theme with the Wilson
in those early days, though. But they could all do it, and so here a 3-part register of falsetto is amazing.
Yeah,
there is something to be.
Yeah,
I was going to say there's something to be said for the fact that it's family. I mean, you got the 3 Wilson brothers and Mike. Like, you got to wonder, is it just, by nature of the fact that they're related and come from the same gene pool, does that contribute to that blend
I
being so
believe
beautiful? That. Yeah, I do too, honestly.
And see the Bee Gees.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, same thing.
See
Exactly.
the Avett Brothers.
That's right.
The Osmonds. See the Jacksons, and there is something about a blend of people that are related for I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's the sonic matching or whatever, but I think you get a little bit of an extra advantage. I think you get a couple extra points of vocal advantage when you have relatives in.
And I think the brothers knew what Brian was all about too. I mean, they were always, I think they were always in his corner. Championing him. I mean, maybe they didn't maybe speak out as much or whatever. There's a lot of legalities going on later on and that kind of thing. But I think for the most part, they kind of understood where he was coming from, but they couldn't. I think they knew within themselves that they didn't have what he had.
Yeah.
In terms of the ability to craft this stuff
and hear this stuff,
and to literally just hear it in your head and then use the studio as an instrument to bring that out. Is just
I think Dennis developed it over time, but Pacific Ocean Blue is a beautiful album, but he didn't have it from the jump the way he didn't have it from the jump the way Brian did, and he had so many demons that he really couldn't harness it.
Yeah,
quite the same way that Brian
could slower. Yeah, he developed on a slower rate, but still had unrealized talent that had he kind of probably put more into it, probably could have seen that. Now, in the mid '60s, specifically 1964, Brian has a basically nervous breakdown when he was they were about to go on a 2-week U.S. tour, and he broke down sobbing. He's like, I can't do it. And this was probably the beginning of when people should have been concerned, because he was a very fragile person, and his father loomed heavily. We're not going to get into that, but his father loomed heavily in his life, and trying to win his respect or admiration or just even understanding what he was doing. So at that point, he says, I'm just retiring from the road. I'm going to spend my time in the studio because that's where I'm comfortable anyway. And I've got a lot of ideas to work on. And out comes Pet Sounds. And we're not going to really talk about Pet Sounds because we've got a whole episode about Pet Sounds, which you can go refer to. Chris, it sounds like you have something you want to add to it, though. But
no, not at all. I mean, Pet Sounds. I think Pet Sounds is brilliant. I know you have the episode. There's not. I think you've probably said everything that needs to be said on that episode.
I think you can kind of stop this episode right now and then go listen to the Pet Sounds episode and then pick us up again. So now, great to have you back after the Pet Sounds episode. So what and that was the thing. And with Brian being very competitive, that was we talk about it. This is as much as we'll give you is there was that back and forth between the Beach Boys and the Beatles, and and the famous story or famous event is Brian hears Rubber Soul and he says, this is a complete thought. This is like one album that makes sense. Everything fits. I need to do that. I need to make that and do it myself. And that's where Pet Sounds comes out. The Beatles hear Pet Sounds like, oh shit, wow, this is like something like we weren't prepared for. So they come back with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which then becomes lionized as the best album of all time. And we'll leave that there.
Which we have an episode about as well.
We have an episode about that too.
And you can go there as well.
Beach Boys are in there. So
we do make those comparisons. Yes.
Yeah, that'll take care of the mid '60s. So then what happens? And then what happens after is really the story. It's the tragedy. It's the triumph that leads to the tragedy that then leads to the triumph again, like a phoenix rising. This was I actually the more I thought about this too. So, like Eric said, Brian will use collaborators to help to write lyrics and bounce ideas off of. Not like an Elton John and Bernie Taupin thing. It's not like Bernie Taupin will just write stuff down and hand it to Elton John, and then Elton John goes and writes a song. Brian will have hours and hours of conversations with collaborators about how I felt about this and what. How did this make me feel? What are we trying to get across? So he does collaborate in an intimate way. But then, lets the writer kind of do stuff. So with Pet Sounds, it was very much
put into words what he's feeling and what he's thinking. Yes,
exactly. Yeah. And Pet Sounds did that brilliantly in a very simple and straightforward manner. Right. This is what it feels like to be growing up, to be conflicted about the future. What am I going to be as an adult? It's very direct. Pet Sounds, a very direct statement. It's not. There's not a lot to decode. The brilliance is getting Van Dyke Parks to work on his next project, who is very illustrative with his words, very abstract with his words.
Yeah, very.
A complete opposite of what Pet Sounds was going to be. This is going to be very abstract, a lot of Gothic Americana lyrics, stuff that didn't necessarily make sense, but it was more plays on words. And I think what it would have done, and the project was going to be called Smile, and it was very ambitious. It was had it been pulled off back then, I think it would have surpassed Sgt. Pepper. Just for what it was, where music was going, and how it wasn't psychedelic, but it kind of was, but it was very abstract, but it was all, kind of stitched together into one experience. And I think people coming off of Sgt. Pepper that would have heard that, and again, because it was a clean break for the Beach Boys of we're putting a certain type of music behind us, and we're going into the new frontier. And I think that was also kind of would have given them the ability to do whatever they wanted, right? Because they were making that break. They were kind of saying, here, we're going to do something totally different. And you can't go back to that stuff after that. You're really kind of drawing a line in the sand. So prove me wrong or prove me right.
I mean, I will be honest and say I had a hard time. There's a lot of stuff on Smile that I have a hard time relating to or absorbing.
Yeah.
But then there are moments that I'll listen to, like Heroes and Villains, Our Prayer. Like there are definitely songs that as I go through Smile that I really do enjoy. But as a whole listening experience, maybe I need to spend more time with it. I feel like I have a hard time absorbing parts of it, honestly.
It's difficult because we're not really getting, first of all, we're not getting the reconstruction. I'm talking about the set that came out, the reconstructive, Beach Boys version. You really can't get a good sense of what it would have been. I think it's because it certainly doesn't, the sound quality is not up to snuff there. There's, of course, the versions of songs that I think they used alternate versions of like good vibrations and things like that on that specifically. Because then you're just taking stuff from that, like Smiley Smile, which ended up being the
remnants,
the compromise, as it were, which is a weird album in itself. I mean, that is a very strange thing. That's even harder to kind of conceptualize because you just got little musical passages.
Yeah, there's little snippets and ideas
posing as songs, and there's really not much there to chew on. And but when he did it in what was it, 2004, he came out with the
Brian Wilson presents Smile.
I got a really big kick out of it. That's for me the seeing it, watching the concert. Watching that performance is when I really got into that, and I dug it. I was just like, okay, because you could see in each individual musician doing their part, and you're really getting a sense that these guys really got it together, and they just made his vision come out.
Yeah,
whether or not. Now I do prefer Pet Sounds, because it's a much more personal statement.
Oh, yeah, I do too,
and much more relatable, set against the backdrop of this madness of just whistles and bells and using instruments that nobody's ever used before in a popular song. But you really,
for sure.
But with Smile, it's like, it's hard to kind of go from something like, I just wasn't made for these times to vegetables.
Yeah.
Right.
He's talking about being well and he's, there's a sense of that sort of like hippie culture coming into play now. It's not just taking drugs. It's also taking care of yourself, your spiritual inwardness, and being healthy, because a lot of people like that were living, at the time in the 60s, or like in the communes, they were growing their own vegetables, actually, doing this kind of stuff. So I think those are the kinds of things that he was, sort of.
He owned a health food store in the 60s.
Well, there you go. So
yep.
yeah, so
it was called the Radiant Radish.
So there really wasn't a proper theme to the album. I feel like it doesn't have. It
was supposed to be like a travelogue of America.
Okay.
You have references to Hawaii and Plymouth Rock, Roll Over, and Cover the Cornfield. So it was supposed to be this kind of American Gothic, kind of abstract travelogue of America. So I kind of and I dug. What I like about Smile is the creepiness of it. Some of it is. I like that some of it's off-putting and it's strange, and he's got especially that song Fire. I don't know if you ever heard that, where he was trying to recreate the sound of fire, and that's really when the mental issues started coming in, because at this point Brian was taking a lot of drugs, a lot of LSD. Starting to get very paranoid. People weren't, and then the Beach Boys are like, what is going on? We don't know what this is. They really weren't supporting him.
Yeah.
Nope.
So you take someone with, so you take somebody with already a very fragile ego and disposition already. Before that, you take the nervous breakdown, you take these undiagnosed mental issues that come in, and then you take drugs on top of that.
Which didn't help.
And you've got to.
No, it just exacerbates it.
Yeah. You've got, he became very paranoid. People are after him. He thought when he was recording the sessions for the song Fire that, there had been fires in LA around that time. He thought that him doing these sessions had caused the fires.
Wow.
So
that's very prophetic.
He was really starting to kind of get lost in the sauce.
Yeah.
And then like I said, then with no support from the Beach Boys, he just kind of lost control of everything or let go of everything and just said, I'm done. Put this away. I'm done as well. Like I have nothing, basically he didn't say it, but he has nothing to offer them for the most part. That's a pretty broad statement.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, not entirely true, but for the most part, he pulled away. He again was not the leader of the Beach Boys anymore. He was really basically incapacitated.
Well, when you're thinking that this is the absolute, could be or could have been the absolute pinnacle of your creativity and your genius, and when you don't have that support, and you don't have the whole time, it's heartbreaking to hear him talk about. Voices were always there in his head from the ever since he was a child. He would hear voices in his head, and this sort of, I can't imagine what that's like, with voices telling you that they're telling you you're no good and you're not talented, you don't know what you're doing, and all this kind of, it's like demons trying to pull you down into into your own hell.
And then your dad just kind of feeding that with his father's behaviors.
Right. Exactly.
It's like psychological torture.
Yeah.
Really, that's going on. And so then Van Dyke Parks checks out because he was just getting, unending grief from Mike Love about the lyrics as well. What does this mean? Is this drug related? Like they just didn't. Again, that's really where the separation was. Is they just didn't get what was happening in music. That there was this big transition going on.
Right.
Music was changing from the teeny bopper, girls on a date music like that. You could keep making that, but the shelf life on that was not going to be very long with psychedelia on the horizon, and then whatever changes that would bring to music. So, in a way, like it or not, the fact that Smile got started, got so far, and got aborted, it actually did end up changing the Beach Boys forever. They were not able to go back to what they were doing because A, they lost their leader, and B, Good Vibrations, which he did finish, was so radically different. It was pointing in a new direction.
Which like Mike Love was a part of. He's in a way, he just kind of got it in an instant, even just an instant. Like he understood. And there's that whole bit about, them writing the song together in the sandbox and the piano and, that kind of thing. But it took forever. How many weeks did it take to record?
6 months, I heard. I remember reading
one
somewhere.
Track. Yeah.
6 months to do one track, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, he was meticulous about redoing things, doing it over again. Now, he got in his own mind.
Now, was that insecurity or just his obsessive mind with?
It was probably everything, right? It was probably because he was being called a genius back then.
Mm-hmm.
And he said he had kind of developed also a little bit of a Jesus complex.
Now I wonder if
he could do no, there has to be some imposter, that he was untouchable. But then you contrast that with somebody who's very insecure on the inside.
Yeah, there has to be some imposter syndrome there too, man. Like you think about people are going to figure me out and realize I'm not as awesome as they think I am. Like there's got to be some of that too.
Again, those are the voices. I'm pretty sure. I mean, he would go on to say that those are the kinds of things that he would hear in his head. And I wonder, in the case of Good Vibrations, I mean, the genesis of that was recorded as early as the Pet Sound sessions.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if this was a response to what the Beatles were doing by having the lone tracks, sort of like the Strawberry Fields kind of thing. I wonder if this was that in a response to that, because I'm kind of not unclear as to which side it leans more to. Is it leans more to Pet Sounds or does it lean more to Smile?
I think it leans more to Smile.
Okay.
Because it sounds less like there's 20 people from the Wrecking Crew.
Right.
It sounds a little bit, there's those elements are there, but it sounds a little bit more stripped down. And then you throw the theremin in and it just kind of pushes it.
Yeah, it's a little out there.
It pushes it after Pet Sounds, but it still has some of that. There's still some of that orchestration in there.
Yeah,
but I think it pushes it forward towards what's much like Strawberry Fields was in advance of Sgt. Pepper.
Right. It sounds. I mean, it stands alone. I mean, for sure. I mean, it's even. It feel to me. It feels even out of place on Smile. I feel like it just by itself. It's its own little mini symphony.
Yeah,
and it's heralded as such. And I think it should have just left it alone there. But I mean, because I know he changes the lyrics too, right? For the version on Smile, like it's
that was the original version. The original lyrics. And
okay.
Changes. So, by 1968, Brian Wilson was pretty much done. He had begun self-medicating. He was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. Thoughts of suicide. They'd even built a studio in his house to help facilitate being creative. You can just come downstairs from the bedroom and we'll be recording. And that made things actually worse in some cases because everybody was always around the house. All that stuff was always there reminding him of his failure. The Beach Boys were there and they're recording downstairs and Brian, come down. And he wouldn't, it was very difficult to get him to come down. Even in his own house downstairs to a studio. He would half finish stuff, leave it for Carl to finish. He would have scraps of ideas, but he was just not the same person. And unfortunately, I'm sure there was a section of people that ascribed it to, wow, he just took too many drugs. There was probably some people that ascribed it to, well, he's got some stuff wrong with him, but nobody did anything about it either way, really. There really wasn't that.
That's the tragedy of it. Yeah.
To identify it, right? It was, it was kind of well, that's what, he's taking drugs.
And he developed a reputation as being a liability. So, and it's, it's unfortunate too. This is the thing that I always think about with the Beach Boys. Once you get past Smile and all those things Friends and Wild Honey and Sunflower and Holland, there's some really cool shit on all of those records. I think was it Sunflower is a great record. That's an awesome album. And is it because people didn't want to promote Brian and his mania? Is it because people thought of the Beach Boys as this early 60s pop group and they had moved on in the late 60s? Or what is it that they weren't as commercially viable in that back end of the 60s? Because now those records have, people have reassessed them and given them the credit that they're due, because those are all brilliant albums in their own way.
Yeah, they put out expansive box sets for each one of those too. I think it's a little bit of both, Chris. I think it's, well, where's Brian? If you don't have Brian, you don't have the Beach Boys. And
he has a lot of writing credits on those records. It's not like he wasn't writing.
Yeah, but he wasn't kind of it wasn't his touch on things, right? It wasn't, there was no trademark stuff. Like you said, it was the Beach Boys had to chart a new course, but and those albums are great. I have all of them, and they all have interesting stuff on them. But what was it, and where did it fit in at the time? Like it seemed, and that was the problem with the Beach Boys, is they kind of already started building themselves as an oldies act, even though they were making new music. It wasn't, there was no like inspiration behind it. Again, there was still like that reliance on the oldies and the old material and that kind of stuff.
And therefore slightly more clean cut, not embracing, I'm sure, critically they were probably, panned for trying to be in the times of being psychedelic and all this, but you still had that reputation of the surfing, band, and they certainly didn't change in that sense, because they were still touring at this point, right? I mean, they were still going around, they were still doing a lot of that.
They had to. Yeah.
Mike Love was still like more or less became the leader, I guess, at this stage, right? I mean, he was just, and they were still kind of, focusing on doing and keeping them alive in that way, even though even their father was like, they're not, you guys aren't going to last. And, another 5 years,
nobody's to their music.
Nobody's going to be listening to this anymore.
Yeah. No belief of this as a long-term type of career,
Yeah.
And that was a lot, the other thing happened is around this time, Murray Wilson, Brian's father, sold Brian's catalog out from under him, Sea of Tunes.
That's such a tragedy.
He sold that. But Brian would write the words, and he doesn't do this often, but he would write the words and music to one song in 71 that really kind of said everything he needed to say, and it was Till I Die.
Till I Die, yeah. It's one of my favorites.
Because he literally at one point told his gardener, go in the yard and dig a grave.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And he threatened to drive his car off the highway. And I mean, he was in a bad way. And if you listen to Till I Die, it's heart-wrenching. You can hear it's someone in pain. They just don't know what to do and where they fit in life. And it's like, and now he's literally directionless. He doesn't even have music anymore to kind of keep him on the straight and narrow. He's even lost that. And what do you have? And the song is just, like heart-wrenching in a different way that something from Pet Sounds is heart-wrenching. It hurts to hear somebody like this that was so vibrant that has given up and seems directionless. He was just, So in the 70s, his output was sporadic. Like I said, if you go, he's got plenty of writing credits, and his voice shows up. You can hear him on some of the songs where they would get him, and that falsetto is still kind of there. It starts to get a little gravelly in the 70s because he's smoking and drinking and smoking and drinking and smoking and drinking and
eating. He gained a lot of weight too.
In bed and gaining weight and just doing all that kind of stuff, So from 73 to 75, I mean, he basically secluded himself away, but he's staying in his bedroom, abusing drugs, sleeping, not doing anything. I mean, he was just kind of off, really literally off the charts. His family had to take over his financial affairs. I mean, the guy was just at that point, everybody figured, okay, Brian is going to be the first one to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Out of all the Wilson, it's like this, it's like, let's just kind of get, when you kind of start getting ready in your mind or whatever, it's like, this guy's on a road, he's on a path, and it's been like this for a while. So we're probably going to hear one day that he OD'd or at some point, so.
But you're right though. Just the sort of, it was the apathy of it. The absolute apathy of everyone around him. It's like, yeah, okay, Brian's he'll probably go, but is anybody going to really care? Is it, it's because nobody could really truly understand what he was going through, because this stuff just wasn't being diagnosed. Nobody was really looking into it. Nobody was, he definitely had his demons and this and that. And it's like drugs is, you can only blame drugs so much for, but these things were there even before that. You write a song like In My Room, go back to that, right? You go from like Till I Die, go back to In My Room and listen to that song. He was crying for help even then, I think, or at least the isolation aspect of trying to, you know what I'm saying? Like it's just. And
I think part of it too is that they were all, the Wilson family was really like messed up. Dennis couldn't help anybody. Dennis couldn't help himself. Dennis was in a lot of the same issues, and I don't know about as much about Carl, but I'm sure Carl had his own issues too, and they were all
abusing,
right, exactly,
to different extents. I mean, Dennis was definitely the partier. I mean, that was his like lot in life. He's like, I'm Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. I'm the drummer. Let's party.
And then I think part of that too is him numbing himself from. I think the whole thing with the Manson family. I think
the Manson family and
destroyed his psyche in some way too, and that's how he was medicating to deal with it.
Yeah, yeah. So Brian's output in the '70s was minimal, or it was some highlights, and some of the stuff was recycled, stuff that was laying around, but they kind of kept it up.
Beach Boys Love You was all him, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, that's what we're getting to. Is first something magical happens in the Beach Boys world. Is this double album, Endless Summer, comes out, which is like a greatest hits collection, and lo and behold, in 1975 or whatever, people were nostalgic for the surfing sounds of the Beach Boys. There was the kind of this turnaround of, oh wow, remember how great that was, after Vietnam and everything that's going on in America. Like this was hearkening back to a simpler time, and then all of a sudden the Beach Boys were in vogue again. They can, but that's when they kind of became like a jukebox thing. But the thing became, we got to get Brian out there. We got to kind of get him, active again. And first they tried Mike Love's brother, Steven. They kind of appointed him as kind of like a guardian. They would try and get him up and wrangle him, and he couldn't. And then they met this guy, Eugene Landy, who had, some radical treatment theories, some really crazy ideas, but he's like, I can get it done, but you got to kind of let me do what I do. I know what's wrong with him, and I can fix it, but basically kind of sign everything over to me. They put him under 24-hour surveillance. I mean, his methods were radical, but at the time they seemed to be working. He was getting, and some of it is like almost like confrontational therapy, like getting in his face and not accepting that you're just saying no because you're Brian Wilson. You're not getting out of bed. You're getting out of bed today. You're going to get out of bed. You're going to sit in front of the piano. You're going to write a song today. So it's kind of that type of stuff, but to the nth degree, if you can imagine that.
Yeah.
But it did seem to work. So they launched this campaign of Brian is back. He's going out on tour, and I was out on tour with them, and which leads to, the Beach Boys Love You, which was supposed to be called Brian Loves You, because it's
a solo album.
His first solo album. He wrote everything, and he sings on everything, and he plays everything pretty much. So, and it's a curious album. It's, there's some moments of brilliance, and you can kind of feel him there. And then there's some weird stuff, like songs like Johnny Carson. It's literally about Johnny Carson. It's about the Tonight Show.
Yeah.
But then there's other stuff like the solar system and great things, but he's definitely damaged. But, at least it was an attempt to kind of get him going again. And then, and then there were songs that he wrote that were called hamburger songs, because Dennis would bribe Brian with a hamburger, say, if you write a song, I'll give you a hamburger. So he would just write a song just to get the hamburger. And so there was a lot of that output. And even Brian called, these were called hamburger songs. They weren't that great, but it's just kind of like, if I write a song, I get a hamburger, so I can have a hamburger. Hilarious.
And you could probably tell, just by, which ones were good. And it's just, I don't know. Yeah. It's sad. It
is sad, but you know what? When we get to the 80s is kind of where everything starts to turn around. Although in was it 81, 82, Dennis Wilson would be the one to pass away.
83, he died, I think.
83, he drowned.
Yep.
he was living on a boat, and I think some stuff, his girlfriend or whatever, somebody threw some stuff overboard, through his like possessions. So he went diving down in the water to get his stuff that was at the bottom of the marina or whatever. And he just, was too drunk, just had too much drugs inside of him. He was seeing Christine McVie at the time from Fleetwood Mac. She was very much involved with him.
Yeah.
So he passes, but Brian, the stuff with Landy seems to be working. Brian's losing weight. He's really thin. There's this talk of kind of getting him, to make a comeback without the Beach Boys, to make a proper solo album.
Mm-hmm.
Which 1988's Brian Wilson album comes out. With the help of a lot of people. There was a lot of every song had a co-producer and all these different songwriters to bring it in. And and Eric and I have talked about it in the past. I remember when it came out, I was so excited because Lindsey Buckingham was supposed to be on it and Jeff Lynne was on it. So like that was my in. I wasn't a Beach Boys fan yet. Yeah. I knew Brian Wilson, but it was more important that Jeff Lynne and Lindsey Buckingham were actually on one album together. Turns out Lindsey Buckingham didn't make the album. He got
relegated to a B side or something like that.
He's on the special edition.
Yeah.
But this was kind of like, this was a proper comeback for all intents and purposes.
Yeah.
Landy's involvement was over. It was heavy handed, and that would lead to him breaking with him finally. But there's a lot of songs on that album that I can connect to. Like,
Oh, absolutely. This was the album that started for me. This is when I understood, started to really, I don't understand the whole Brian Wilson story. I read the book. I think it was the biography that came out at that time.
That they've since disavowed and been like,
which was a lot of the things we were talking about.
Yeah.
A lot of the things we were just talking about are in that book in much greater detail.
Yeah.
I was like, I had no idea. And that album was around at the time. So I really dug that record. And like Dean, there were songs on it. It was very, very, very extremely polished, very 80s, very synthy, heavy, but the vocals were there.
Yeah.
Did a lot of the vocals himself. Is harmonizing with himself. It's just outstanding.
Yeah, I don't know.
One for the Boys is just
that's a great song.
Beautiful.
His ability to stack vocals.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
Is amazing. It's even more amazing when he does it himself. It's probably easier because he knows exactly what he needs. So
that's right.
So like the song "One for the Boys" is like a 80s version of Our Prayer.
Yeah,
it's really cool.
It's literally that. It's just vocalizing, but it's all him. It's heavy. It's thick with vocals.
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of like, there's a spark here. Like this is
what I liked about it too was the fact that his voice, obviously has different. It has aged. But you dig it because you feel the pain. You can understand the mileage, if you will.
Sure.
In the vocal. But when he's, like you say, when he's able to stack those beautiful harmonies alongside of his lead, it's like you're hearing, it's supposed to be backing vocalist, but it's him.
Yeah.
And that's just, it's absolutely stunning, and I was blown away by that record. And I remember my ex-wife's friend from work, she was a big Brian Wilson fan. So she actually told me a lot about him and his struggles and things like that. And I lent her a copy of that cassette to her, and I never got it back. She was over the moon that she didn't even know that it even existed. Much less because she was such a fan, but yet she didn't know that this thing had come out. I gave it to her and I never got it back. I ended up getting the CD.
you got shorted $8, but you made something.
There you go. Yeah.
You made somebody fan. I mean, the opening track would become one of his modern classics, Love and Mercy.
Love and Mercy.
He would use that to close every show once he started touring again. That became his closer.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't God Only Knows or Caroline No or something like that. It was Love and Mercy. It became his new mantra.
Mm-hmm.
It became a way for him to live.
Yeah.
Right. And it's a sublime album. It is very 80s, but there's Rio Grande, and I remember reading at the time, I think it was Lenny Waronker or whoever was in charge of Warner at the time, Reprise or whatever, said, hey, like, do something like that, like was like Smile, like it was supposed to be like, and that's what that is. That's kind of like that pastiche of all these different movements and different things. And
this little mini
is kind of like a little, reassembly of that, and showing that he still had that innate ability. It was there. He was the one that was suppressing it. He was the one that was drowning it with the drugs. He was the one that was pushing it down. But you can't keep someone like that. It's there, and no matter how hard he tried to take it away and burn it out of his brain, you put him with the right people, and that became the thing. Is he, at this point, he needed a lot of people to be around him. He needed
the push. He needed the collaboration. He needed to be collaborating again, I feel. But I think a lot of what went into this record, I think definitely comes from him, in the sense, just the quirkiness of it. Because it could have very well been just a bland, well produced of the time album with another producer, but they let him do these little quirky things.
Right.
Just the bells are still there, the weird sounds. It's all sampled at this point, but he still had the genius to know exactly, to put those things in as little features and to kind of change it up and just it's a marvelous album to listen to with headphones, and it's great.
It's so
great.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We're gushing over this. We could have done a whole episode just on this one album. I'm surprised we never did.
We probably will. So
but yeah,
we'll reconvene to do Brian Wilson.
But this is the time. This was the time when I got into Brian Wilson big time. And then Pet Sounds came after. And it wasn't probably until 96 when the box set came, the Sessions box.
96 it was.
That's when I really took the deep dive into that album, and just like, I was, So there it is.
So after that album comes out, Dr. Landy is inserting himself more and more on the first solo album. He demanded writing credits, even though he really didn't contribute much. He demanded executive producer credits. He started kind of, I think, giving up all of his other clients to kind of manage now. He was kind of like Brian's manager, kind of like a guru. He started really overstepping boundaries of the doctor-client, doctor-patient relationship.
Making
taking all of his money. It was insane. Oddly enough, insane. His next album was going to be called Sweet Insanity, and almost everything was written by Landy. All the lyrics. They submitted to Warner's, and Warner's rejects it. They're mainly because of a one song called "Smart Girls," which is a rap song.
Oh God.
And the one thing we don't need is Brian Wilson to rap.
Rapping.
I think all of us can agree with that. So Warner Reprise, and at that point, that's when things, it became important and necessary to extricate Eugene Landy from Brian's life. He had taken him as far as he could go. He had gotten him back to functionality. His methods were not what you could describe as ethical, but he had done it. But now it was time. And
I was trying to capitalize on that.
Exactly. He could not let him go. And that's when he met Melinda Ledbetter, who kind of take, there's, you can read stories about her, what her influence was, and what her part in certain things were in the business affairs later on. But he had stability. He finally had stability. People understood what his needs were, like the proper medication. He's being over medicated with Landy, so there was finally a team to understand what they needed to do to kind of bring him back, which would lead to 1998's Imagination, which was kind of, really, worked with Joe Thomas, who was like a really AOR producer. It was kind of like light, kind of got through. I liked it. That's really when I kind of started to get into Brian Wilson, when Imagination came out, because it was a great, I have the DVD about the making of it, and Jimmy Buffett and all these people were on it, and blah, blah, blah. And then it's floated like, why don't you play some shows? Which Live at the Roxy, I think, was the first CD release of him. And this is a guy that's got some, stage fright. He hasn't toured since, 1966, 64, whatever. To go
was
out
he toured with the Beach Boys in the 70s?
He did. He did.
But
the
70s or the 80s where Mike Love was going to miss some shows, and they got Brian to fill in for him.
And I'm sure he wasn't, in full cognitive.
Yeah. No, probably not.
Yeah. Full cognition. Like and now he's the leader. He is the front piece. It is Brian Wilson on tour. Mm-hmm. If you look at some of the footage of the Beach Boys in the 70s, he's sitting at a keyboard. He's not really doing anything. He's kind of there. Right. Sometimes he'd be animated, but it was more like, you better do this, kind of under threat. But now it's time for him to reemerge, and I had the pleasure of, I think I saw him 5 or 6 times.
Wow.
In that era, I saw the Pet, he did the symphonic Pet Sounds. He did Smile. I saw him at, before he did Smile, I saw him at BB King's in New York City. And so it was like a dinner. It was like a dinner thing. And BB King's is very small.
Yep.
And I remember I was sitting there with my ex-wife. Mm. Since we're bringing exes into it. And I look back, we were eating dinner, and I look back right behind me, and Brian is standing at the bar.
Oh, wow.
BB King's very small. And so he was standing right at the bar, and I'm kind of like, I was like, he's right there. But I'm like, you know what? He was by himself and he was having a drink. I'm like, I'm going to leave him alone. Like, he doesn't need, like, no one knows he's there, right? It was because the place is kind of dark. It's like, you know what? He doesn't need me going up to him. Because I know, more people would probably start, like, I was like, you know what? Leave him alone. We'll just let him be. Oddly enough, Jeffrey Foskett, who was part of the band and part of the Beach Boys, he randomly walked up to our table. He's like, "Hey, how you guys doing tonight?" I'm like, "We're doing really good," but it's like,
but Brian, he's right there.
But did he get Brian to come over here? And
I didn't want to. I didn't want to bother. I understood.
That's very cool.
My time would come, as I've told that story in the past, that I would actually shake his hand.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah, and then I saw him. So when I saw him at BB King's, he played a song called Cabanescence, which was from Smile. So he had started to, because he had never wanted to perform Heroes and Villains. He didn't want anything to do with Smile. And now all of a sudden it's like, you're playing Cabanescence? Like, that's weird. So his band kind of started to breach that subject of, let's look at this stuff with the intent of just playing it live. Like, we're starting to play some songs from Smile, like in a live setting, and we're filtering more in. So they kind of, one of the band members was really kind of going through the archives of stuff, and he mentioned, Brian, maybe we should just kind of, take a look at this. And Brian didn't say no. Because for years you couldn't mention Smile. That music is evil. It frightens me. I'm afraid of it.
Yeah.
I don't want to hear it. It was triggering to him. And Brian said, you know what? Once I got through in the beginning that happened. And he goes, once I got through with it, through that was fine. So they start assembling Smile. They had the notes. They had all the Beach Boys bootlegs and like putting this stuff together to be able to perform it live. And they're like, we've got some transcripts of lyrics. He goes, but I can't read that word. Like, what word is that? So Brian's like, I'll call up Van Dyke right now. So he calls up Van Dyke Parks, and he's like, we're looking at Smile stuff, and we have this lyric, but we don't know what the word. And Van Dyke's like, hang on a second. I called him back, and he's like, oh, the word is Indian. He had all of his notes. He had all of his stuff. He kept everything. So They bring Van Dyke Parks into this and say, get back into the mindset of what were you guys doing? What were you trying to accomplish? And that's how they assembled Smile. They, there was some new things that they did, some vocal interludes and orchestrations, but this is them, the two people that originally conceived it, reassembled Smile, one of the most popular, famous, long lost albums, right? Famous unreleased album of all time. Mm-hmm. It was legendary. Eric, I didn't even know what it was, and I remember hearing about it. It was like legendary lost album. Yeah. Smile. Like what?
I remember reading a giant article in Mojo about it, and like people having like tapes and trying to assemble what it should have been and what it was meant to be like, and trying to figure all that stuff out.
Yeah. It's like, what is this? And the two people that, that were there came together, and then they brought it out on tour. I think I took my mother and my nephew to it. And my mom was just kind of like into Brian, like the Beach. And I said to my mom, I remember saying to my mom, I'm like, listen, I said, they're going to be playing this album called Smile. I said, they're going to get to the Beach Boy stuff after. Yeah. You're not going to probably know any of the first part of the concert. Like I had to give her the preface, of like, you're not going to know this part of it, cause then they'd come back and they'd do all the hits, and we got through it. So then my meeting Brian Wilson story was, Paul Simon was playing Jones Beach, and for some reason Brian was opening for Paul Simon. So one of my famous thing is I go see the opener and then I leave. I don't stay I did it with the Cult and Metallica. Why not do it with Paul Simon and Brian Wilson?
That's crazy.
Chris is like shaking his head like, what are you, stupid?
I can't imagine walking away from a concert like that.
So, well, here's why. So Brian does his he opens the show, right? And he leaves, but he was selling merch and he was signing merch.
Oh, wow.
Like, oh shit. He's like signing merch. And I have the posters hanging up, but, and he had this great poster. It looks like a dollar bill, and it's like, in Brian we trust. And he's in the middle, like George Washington. And it looks like I'll take a picture and send it to you guys, but it's a really cool poster. So I go there, and there wasn't a ton of people there. And he's signing, and I got my poster. I'm like, okay, this is it. Like, this is the shot. This is the one, because now he's in public and he's doing stuff, and I'm right across from the man. Mm-hmm. So I put my poster down, and he signs it. But then before he hands me the poster back, I put my hand out and I take his hand and I shake it. I didn't ask.
What did he do?
I was like, thank you for everything. I appreciate it. But I just went and I just kind of went for it. I'm like, this, you're not going to get the shot. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So I just reached out, I grabbed his hand and I shook it. And
that's awesome.
And I'm like, at that point I was like, we can leave. Paul Simon's not really going to do anything for me at this point.
Wow.
I don't care if it's me and Julio by the schoolyard. I don't care what you have. I have Brian Wilson's signature on a poster, and I shook his hand. We need to leave. We're good. I'm stupid like that, Chris.
Well.
Paul Simon's got to be put on a pretty good show.
Yeah.
In retrospect, I regret. Yeah, in retrospect, I regret. I probably should have stayed for Paul Simon, but I was like, nah, it's all good. So, and through the 2000s, right, Eric? I mean, he's been touring, he's been flourishing, putting out albums. He reunited with the Beach Boys for, That's Why God Made the Radio. He did a Gershwin album.
That Gershwin album's really cool, actually.
Yeah, I have that.
That is.
That's a good album.
He did another album, what's called instead of In My Room, it's called At My Piano. I think it's like instrumental versions of some songs. So he really did kind of, we got him back as good as we're going to get. I think you kind of have to measure, temper your expectations.
Yeah, for sure.
But I mean, the fact that he was able to like deal with the world of stuff that he dealt with through the 60s and most of the 70s and part of the 80s, and then be able to like come out the other side and still like produce like viable, like good music, and to be able to perform, live, and perform live well for the most part. Like it's really a testament to his spirit that he was able to overcome all that shit and really have a pretty amazing third act at the end of his life.
Yeah.
And you're still very, very, that he had every step of the way, he was very still much the producer. I mean, the backing band that he had was amazing.
Oh yeah, they were top notch.
But of course, he's telling them, hey, look, that didn't sound right. You got to get that right. I mean, he's, behind the scenes, you see, footage and, documentaries and such, which is so, that's the stuff that, it's great. I mean, the actual performance, of course, he's weathered. He's not going to sound like he did, but so well that that's not what matters. It's what matters is how it's presented and how it's, that they get it right.
Yeah.
Because they're under his tutelage.
He's willing to do it. He's a willing participant in this.
That's right.
Yeah. Not being forced or coerced. Yeah. And I think that's what was important, is that he emerged, at first reluctantly and then on his own terms, and then was able to embrace it. And I think that's what endeared him to people more.
Oh yeah.
That the story of Brian Wilson is one of, like, you couldn't write it. You'd be like, yeah, this is a fantasy. Like, the guy was, so deep into drugs, he didn't even know who he was. And now he comes back,
And to hear such an outpouring of his passing, just the measure and artists from all walks of genres just coming out and admire, and just heartfelt tribute, not just saying, oh, we're sorry or we lost the great one, but actually really articulating what they're saying. James Hetfield of Metallica comes out. I mean, who would have thought? Then he said that God only knows, it doesn't get any better than that. To hear somebody from Metallica say that.
Yeah. Or Gene Simmons, or it's crazy.
About possibly one of the greatest songs ever written, but it's not just a pop song now. It is heralded as, a piece of great music, and that,
and great poetry.
That touches me. That gets me right here. And I teared up everything I read. I'm tearing up. I'm watching The Long Promise, which was a hard, difficult watch, because I think he was already getting dementia. He was admitting it even then. Mm-hmm. I came to this thinking I was going to say something like, my hope was that in the last few decades of his life, just in the last 20 years or 25 years or so, that he had actually found peace, that all of that was gone. But apparently that's not the case, because he says as much in this documentary. He's like, I'm scared all the time. He looked terrified, just getting in a car and riding around with this guy from Rolling Stone, who's been really good friends with for so long.
Mm-hmm.
Oh man, I was just like, oh my God, it's just so hard to watch that and just be, but be touched about it at the same time, really get to know, because you didn't see much, I didn't see much about, in his early, his older stage. I didn't see him being interviewed a lot, and that kind of thing. But yeah, the level of respect and the admiration for him and what he's accomplished is just,
I mean, and I think what's interesting about him, or what I've found about him, is that, like, at least what I've experienced with my family in the few days since he's passed away, is that everybody in my family from every generation has been impacted by Brian Wilson and the music of the Beach Boys in some fashion. Like, I remember as a kid having that's how I got into the Beach Boys, like having the cassette of with Pet Sounds on one side and Jimi Hendrix's Smash Hits on the other, like one of those like recorded tapes that my father had. Right. And then just listening to it over and over again. And then, like, my wife, I remember she had, she picked up on watching them when they were on Full House all the time when we were kids, and that was a show we all.
Of course, Stamos.
Right. And then she ended up getting Endless Summer, and then my kids even now, like, asking me to pick and play different songs when we're in the car, because I've been listening to the Beach Boys a lot. Like, everybody's got a story, and, like, my parents, that was their generation. That was the music they started listening to as little kids. It's just he's just so timeless and so relevant to, like, basically the last 60 or 70 years worth of people that have lived in this country. I mean, it's a huge part of the American songbook and American history. He's like,
that's right,
a true American artist. His impact on this country's art is just undeniable.
Mm-hmm. I watched this with the kids the other night, the document, and Kylie is, Nick Jonas, she was a huge Jonas Brothers fan. He was being interviewed for this, and he's talking about Brian. She's like, what's he doing now? I said, you don't understand the impact that this man had.
Yeah.
It's like Chris was saying, it's just multi-generational, and I think it always will be. He'll always be remembered as just the
the
Mozart of our time.
And
do you guys ever hear this website Metacritic?
Yes.
Right. They do like,
Yeah. Okay.
Reviews of albums and stuff like that. And I guess
right. Okay.
Almost like a Rotten Tomatoes. I think also kind of people peer reviewed or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
The Brian Wilson Presents Smile release is the third highest rated album in the history of Metacritic. It's the third highest rated in the history of Metacritic, and he won a Grammy for that album too. So his first Grammy ever would come in 2004.
I won a Grammy until 2004.
Yeah.
Wow, man! I would have thought the Beach Boys records would have won that's crazy.
Nope.
Holy cow!
Nope.
Wow.
So I think it's appropriate maybe to end with some quotes from the man himself. Some of the wisdom or some of the just simple guy that he is, meaning simple that he just spoke plainly. And one of the quotes is, summer means happy times and good sunshine. It means going to the beach, going to Disneyland, and having fun.
Amen.
I'm not a genius. I'm just a hardworking guy. I always do get a little paranoid when I get a lot of attention, but I get used to it.
Wow.
Every now and then I hear voices in my head, but not very clear. I can't understand what they're saying. It's a mental illness. I've been diagnosed as a manic depressive. My mother used to tell me about vibrations. I didn't really understand too much of what that meant when I was just a boy. To think that invisible feelings, invisible vibrations existed scared me to death.
Yeah.
So, you know what? I'm not always in a positive, happy place, but I'm able to concentrate long enough to come up with a really good song.
There it is.
Yep.
There it is. Wow.
Yeah. I think I need the demons in order to write, but the demons have gone. It bothers me a lot. I've tried and tried, but I just can't seem to find a melody.
Wow.
That's frustrating.
Yeah, it is.
This one is heartbreaking. And maybe we'll leave it. I'll give you one and then we'll close on this one. I have stage fright every single concert I've ever done. I have at least 4 or 5 minutes of it. It's an absolute living hell. But here, I think this is what we should leave this episode on. First of all, I want people to understand that I'm here to create for them, to create music for people so they'll know that I'm a source of love and they can depend on my name.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that sums it up pretty well.
Just want it to be known as just like you hear the name Brian Wilson
and you know what he's about.
You're going to get a good song. Oh, Brian wrote this. It's going to be great. I think that's a perfect way to close our tribute. And there's so much more. There's so much material out there for you to digest. Eric referenced at least 4 or 5 different documentaries that are recent. There's a bunch of older ones. There's books. There's videos. There's a lot of material on the man. But I think he truly was one of a kind, and I'm glad that I was able to discover him early on, relatively early on, and enjoy and digest all of the Beach Boys and go through my Beach Boys phase, and be not, it was right when those CDs came out. They were putting 2 CDs on 2 albums on 1 CD in the 90s. So it was like the Beatles. I was literally getting them when they come out, and I just, was just digesting it. So, like we said, if you think the Beach Boys are just surf music, dig a little deeper. Go past 1966. 66 to 75, probably, right, Chris? Would probably.
Yeah, I definitely think you could do that. Absolutely. I think up until people generally will say Holland is the last truly great Beach Boys record. So, I don't know if that's true and that's debatable, but I think from Holland and to back to 66, you find some really genius stuff there.
Surf's Up.
Yep. Surf's Up's a great record too.
Yeah.
And not only that, but just the influence that he had on his brothers. Carl became a producer because of Brian.
Yeah.
because Brian couldn't do it. So Carl wanted to do it. So he, Brian said, go ahead. And he produced Surf's Up. He took that song and rebuilt it to what it was. And it, of course, because it was Another Smile.
And you can hear it's in his brother's image.
Yes,
exactly.
He learned, he learned.
I think one of my favorite songs is Feel Flows. I love that song. That's one of Carl's like best, beautiful song, beautifully, it's like a sort of psychedelic thing, but it's just, just, they understood the genius. They understood this. So they took a little, some education from the guy. I mean, he, and did it right, so albums like that, his influence is still there. Even when he's not there, he's still there.
Yeah. This guy, I think it's just easy to say this guy was just on another level.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like that's, he was channeling something pure, that naivete that we've talked about, Eric and I've talked about it, that naivete that he has, I think is universal. I think it hits, and that's why his music can be so emotional. I think he can hit that. He understands, some of those things are, those early recordings were universal about love and falling in love and all that kind of stuff. And he was just able to really, again, channel it in a way that the Beatles couldn't. He was able to put a thumbprint on it, make it personal. That you felt what he was feeling. So in turn, you felt it made you feel what you were feeling. It made you remember the heartache, or how that felt, and that's the best of what music has to offer.
Exactly. And you don't want to say anything too, like you want to sort of avoid being, sort of the platitudes, sort of, but when you say something like, some of those songs were written for me, you felt like they were written just for you.
Oh yeah, totally.
Everybody says it, it's whatever, but it's true.
That means, again, he's channeling something so unique that if everybody feels like, I know what that feels. I know what that heartache feels.
We've all been there.
Yeah. I think that's the greatest gift that he's given us is he gave us himself.
That's right. That's right.
He gave us his emotions. He gave us what he was feeling. He was able to translate that into words and music that now will transcend his lifetime. And
we were helping him by listening.
And we were here for it. We were here when the man, much like you say, when Mozart was alive, they probably didn't realize how great Mozart was at the time. Now with technology and everything, we can appreciate it while he was here. Yeah. And that's what makes me happy too, is that we're not doing this saying, oh, wow, I'm going to go listen now. We're able to appreciate what he was doing while he was with us. And I think that's the greatest tribute. Yeah. And I thank him for all the concerts and all the hours and hours of music and caring, reading his story and caring about the guy. Mm-hmm. He's just such a gentle guy. It wasn't like this guy was I'm sure when he was doing drugs, but he wasn't an abuser or a prick or racist or, he was a guy, it was a tender guy that just got caught in some circumstances and had some problems, but he clawed his way out, and that's the greatest thing he could have ever done is come back to us, and we were better for it. And I'm glad he was able to enjoy the accolades of that, even if he wasn't comfortable with it, but to feel the love, because that's what he talks about. Love he always talks about love.
That's right. Yeah.
And for, for him to get that love back, after all this time, for people to recognize what he was doing, that even 50, close to 60 years ago, this stuff, it transcends time. It is now timeless.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I think that's going to do it. We're all going to encourage you. Just go down a rabbit hole. If it's videos, if it's old Ed Sullivan appearances, just start somewhere if you haven't. And check out these young guys wearing Pendleton striped shirts that had a vision of California that no one had before and brought it to us. Even now, I still can get that idyllic, mythic vision of California by listening about the waves and how surfing great it is and how California girls are better than any of the girls around the country, around the world. So yeah, I think that's going to do it for our tribute to Brian Wilson. Christopher Clark, thank you so much for joining us on this.
Thank you for having me on this one, man. Like I said to you earlier, Brian, I don't get emotional over celebrities typically passing away, but this one was particularly hard.
I do.
So
for some reason. Because that stuff feels so close. I connect so much with musicians and
musicians for sure.
Like if you feel like you own them.
Yeah,
right?
this one especially.
You like you kind of take on, like Eric says, like this music was written for me. You take ownership of it.
Totally.
When it's done right. So and of course, Eric, we feel this, from '87, maybe even before, but.
Yeah, it's
melancholy, but it's bittersweet as well.
Yeah,
that he's at peace. Mm-hmm. No more demons to chase him around.
That's right.
Yep.
He's up in heaven with his two dogs, Banana and Louie,
and his brother.
His brothers
reunited with the brothers. So
yeah,
I think that's going to do it for this episode of the 3324 podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, you can go ahead and follow us on your favorite podcast platform, or if you're watching us or listening to us on YouTube, go ahead and like and subscribe. This way you'll be notified when new episodes come out. For Christopher Clark, for Eric Cooper, this has been Dean Legiro. We thank you for listening, and we thank Brian Wilson for all the music and everything he's given us. Rest easy, sir.
Rest in peace, Brian.
God bless.
You've been listening to the 3324 podcast with Dean Legiro and Eric Cooper. You can find us on your favorite podcast provider, so please like, subscribe, and rate to become a part of the 3324 family. Your feedback is important, so make sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at 3324 Podcast and on Twitter at 3324P to join the conversation.